Excellent. Yes, here we have Igor Stravinsky and W.H. Auden, our main characters today. Starting with Stravinsky, he was born in 1882 in St. Petersburg, Russia. His father was a well-known operatic bass at the Mariinsky Theater, and his mother was an amateur singer and pianist. His family was financially quite comfortable, but Stravinsky later wrote of disliking his father, being indifferent to his mother, and detesting all but one of his three siblings. Also, in this musical family, none of them were terribly impressed with the young Stravinsky's musical gifts. He didn't have great technique at the piano, which was his primary instrument. However, he was a very good sight reader and would often play through his father's opera scores. He studied law in St. Petersburg at his parents' insistence, but there he became friends with the son of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who was one of the giants of the Russian composition and music world at that time. He showed some pieces to Rimsky-Korsakov, who, again, was not terribly impressed, but Rimsky-Korsakov still encouraged him to keep working. Then, after Stravinsky's father died in 1902, he was free from having to study law anymore and dedicated himself to studying music. At this time, he continued to become closer with the circle of artists that was around Rimsky-Korsakov, but he found their conservative Russian style a little bit constraining, and so he began to study sort of surreptitiously chamber music by French composers like Debussy and Fauré. At the age of 24, he married his first cousin, Yekaterina Nosenko, and they were very happy and very quickly had two children. They would ultimately have four. At this point, Rimsky-Korsakov had become a bit of a champion of Stravinsky's work. He arranged performances of his first symphony and premieres of other concert works before Korsakov's death in 1908. And around this time, Stravinsky's works became known to Sergei Diaghilev, who would become one of the most important collaborators of his career. Now, Diaghilev, whose picture just popped up there, is one of those people whose Wikipedia page, you just think, how did this person do all of that? He was an impresario, he was an art critic and patron, he was a curator. Coco Chanel actually said, she summed up his career in quite a nice way by saying that he invented Russia for foreigners. Basically, what he did was he would buy Russian visual and performing arts, he would bring them from Russia out into many European capitals, many of whom hadn't been exposed to Russian culture before. And perhaps no city got more Russia fever than Paris at this time. And Diaghilev first collaborated with Stravinsky by asking him to orchestrate piano pieces by Chopin for his Ballet Russe, or Russian ballet, there in Paris. As Diaghilev was searching for more and more distinctly Russian subject matter for his ballets, he settled on the Slavic folklore creature of the Firebird. And after offering the commission to several better-known composers, the 27-year-old Stravinsky got the job. The premiere of the Firebird Ballet was a smashing success and instantly made Stravinsky the toast of Paris. It also resulted in what would become a lifelong friendship with one of the 20th century's other greatest composers, Claude Debussy. Firebird was closely followed by another ballet, Petrushka, which tells the tale of a love triangle between three Russian puppets, and its critical and popular success cemented Stravinsky's reputation as one of the great young European composers to watch. Now, the next piece of Stravinsky's trilogy of Russo-Parisian ballets truly changed the course of music history. The Rite of Spring takes place in pre-Christian Russia and follows a pagan ritual in which the maiden dances herself to death to bring on spring. Stravinsky's use of cacophonous textures, atonal passages, irregular meter, and extreme dissonance was truly revolutionary. and it was not universally admired. On top of that, the highly suggestive and modernist choreography by Václav Nijinsky combined to make the Rite of Spring downright scandalous. At its premiere at the Champs-Élysées, boos, hisses, and laughter began mere minutes into the performance of the piece, at some point making it impossible for the dancers to even hear the orchestra, meaning that Nijinsky at times, as he danced on stage, was shouting counts over the cacophony to the dancers on the stage. Objects were hurled at the orchestra from the audience as they tried to play. But perhaps there is no such thing as bad press. We see here on the left, the New York Times in 1913, right after the premiere, their sort of take on it. But this amazing response, I think, in part contributed to the fact that the Rite of Spring has continued to be produced continuously from 1913 to today. And it is one of the most recorded pieces in the orchestral repertoire. Now, I think the original choreography and design for the Rite of Spring was lost for almost half a century until the early 80s when the Joffrey Ballet of Los Angeles recreated the original production. And I wanted to play a little bit of it because even considering that this is 111 years ago, the movement and the music and the styling of it is still, I think, shocking to a contemporary audience. So I wanted to play for you a small excerpt of the Joffrey Ballet's reconstruction of the Rite of Spring. So then we enter into the years of World War I. And from 1914 to 1918, as the First World War was raging, Stravinsky, his wife, and one of their 4 children was in very poor health from typhoid and tuberculosis. So they waited out most of the war in Switzerland. In this period, he focused on smaller scale works and in many cases doubled down on creating identifiably Russian works for a non-Russian audience. Perhaps the most striking example of this is Les Noces, which is a oratorio based on a Russian folk wedding for a small orchestra of piano and percussion that was premiered in 1923, but written in 1917. I'm going to play a little excerpt of a very interesting take on this piece by a group called the Pokrovka Ensemble, which studied Russian folk singing in order to give a more authentic texture to their take of Stravinsky's Les Noces. So let's listen to a small excerpt of this. And just 1 year later, while Stravinsky was on vacation in Italy with Pablo Picasso, he conceived of one of his most beloved works called Pulcinella in 1918, which takes its inspiration from the Commedia dell'arte tradition and the works of the Baroque Italian composer Pergolesi. Now let's take a listen to that. And we hear in these two contrasting pieces, perhaps, why this period did not garner him the critical acclaim or general fame that his earlier period did. We hear in the first example something that is totally cacophonous and bizarre. And then in the second, we hear this sort of neo-Baroque pastiche. So for the devotees of the groundbreaking Stravinsky, the one of the Rite of Spring, something like the Petrushka that we just heard would seem very vanilla, while the people that had been alienated by something like Rite of Spring still weren't going to give a chance even to something like Pulcinella and would have absolutely not enjoyed Les Noces. Also, in both of these pieces, I wanted to point out that we are hearing much smaller ensembles than would have been used for any of those three first ballets that we talked about. And that is true for classical composers across the globe in the period of the two world wars. The international economy was so affected by the world wars that orchestra sizes shrank by necessity, and therefore composers of all types were working more with chamber ensembles than with the large pre-war orchestras that we saw before. In the interwar period, Stravinsky created many more marketable works for orchestras across the globe. Familiar genres like concertos, symphonies, and solo piano pieces made up a lot of his new works. And he entered into partnerships with two notable player piano companies who distributed rolls of his pieces widely. And this ended up being not a great long-term investment because, as we know, we don't see a ton of player pianos around anymore. They sort of got replaced by the availability of recorded music. But Stravinsky was really fascinated by the idea of mechanized music making and of having his music be played not by fallible human hands, but by machines. And also in this time, royalties from his previous works came to a substantial sum, and he began to perform as a conductor of his own works and as a piano soloist in those works as well, touring the globe. He rather infamously had several mistresses in this period, perhaps most notably with Coco Chanel, who I mentioned earlier. He actually at one point moved his wife and children into the home of Coco Chanel, but given the sort of love triangle going on, that became untenable pretty quickly. Somewhat ironically, Stravinsky at this time had a religious awakening and became a devout Roman Catholic. And he continued to write music on Christian themes from about 1926 to his death. Then, on the brink of World War II in 1939, Stravinsky's wife died. And as the war began, he fled to the United States, first as a lecturer at Harvard University. Then, after marrying his longtime mistress, Vera de Beausset, the couple moved to Los Angeles, where many European artists had made their home. There, he dabbled in commercial work for film and Broadway, which seems like such an unusual move for one of the people on the bleeding edge of music at this time. But I wanted to play one thing that he wrote for a big band of the period. The band leader was Paul Whiteman, and this is called Ballet à la Russe. So if you had ever wondered what a composer like Stravinsky would write for an ensemble, like a big band leader. This is a little taste of that. So there's a little taste of the Scherzo alla Russe. After learning English, which is no small feat for anyone, Stravinsky became a naturalized American citizen, and he traveled in the sort of elite expat artistic circles of Los Angeles. He was especially close with authors like Aldous Huxley, Christopher Isherwood, and W.H. Auden, with whom he would create the Rake's Progress later. After seeing the series of etchings by William Hogarth from the 1700s at the Chicago Institute of Art, Stravinsky immediately conceived of it as an opera and enlisted Auden's help. In many ways, The Rake's Progress is the culmination of Stravinsky's so-called neoclassical period, which draws inspiration and musical material, not just from the classical period as we think of it in music, but also from Baroque and 19th century influences. Stravinsky himself was disappointed in the reception to the Rake's Progress because many of the artistic elites were looking for more avant-garde works from him, not this opera that he created, which is so rooted in the operatic tradition and conventions of music. And it's around this point that Stravinsky turns from neoclassical music, so-called, to serialism, which is a type of atonality begun by Arnold Schoenberg in the early 20th century, where each of the 12 notes that make up an octave are organized outside of the traditional scale, and those independent pitches and intervals become the building blocks of a composition more than things like harmony and melody. In his final decades, he continued to travel around the world as a famous conductor while writing large and small works in the serialist style, often on religious themes. I wanted to do one final excerpt for you, and this is a bit from his Requiem Canticles. This is the Dies Irae, and one of the things that I love about this is the Dies Irae is part of the Latin Requiem Mass, and it is about the fear of unending torment in hell. And what I love about this is that he has the choral texture that's going on in the serialist style, and instruments and soloists, but at the same time, he personalizes this internal fear of death and of hell by overlaying the singing that's happening with whispered speaking. So half of the chorus is singing, half of the chorus is speaking. So you hear both the collective fear in the music, and then, to me at least, in the spoken bits, you hear individuals having their own struggles with what lies beyond. Because of his declining health, Stravinsky stopped composing and conducting in 1968, 3 years before his death. To be nearer to his chosen doctor, the Stravinskys moved to New York City that year, where he died at the age of 88. He is buried in Venice, not far away from where the Rake's Progress was premiered at La Fenice, and only a few yards away from his collaborator Diaghilev, for whom he wrote his breakout hits, those first three ballets. Although there were many phases of Stravinsky's voice as a composer, his music in general is often characterized by sharp, rhythmic articulations, minimal vibrato, frequent changes in meter, and a meter that is sort of inexorable, that keeps moving. We talk about rubato as musicians, which is when a performer sort of makes the rhythm a little bit flexible to bring out something interpretive in the music. Stravinsky's music really functions best when it just sort of marches on inexorably. And his work as a whole influenced everything from the most avant-garde composers of the 20th and 21st centuries to the film music of that same period, to things we would hear on TV, to Disney, whose Fantasia uses bits of Rite of Spring. So he truly is one of the most influential composers of so-called art music in the 20th century. And now we will move on to our second character today. W.H. Auden was born in 1907 to a family of minor gentry in the north of England. He was the youngest of three sons and had a middle-class upbringing. Many members of the Auden family were clergy in the High Anglican Church, including both of his grandfathers, and Auden later identified the language found in that tradition as a source of his love for words and poetry. As a good Anglican myself, I thought that it would be worth just doing a little reading of the Anglican prayer book from 1926, because the language of it is so poetic and so what's the word? It's circumspect, but also puts beauty to the fore rather than clarity. So I'll just read this. And lest, through our own frailty or the temptations which encompass us, we be drawn again into sin, vouchsafe us, we beseech thee, the direction and assistance of thy Holy Spirit. Reform whatever is amiss in the temper and disposition of our souls, that no unclean thoughts, unlawful designs, or inordinate desires may rest there. Purge our hearts from envy, hatred, and malice, that we may never suffer the sun to go down upon our wrath, but may always go to our rest in peace, charity, and goodwill, with a conscience void of offense towards thee and towards men, so that we may be preserved pure and blameless unto the coming of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So that's obviously not to proselytize, but just to show you a bit of the very flowery language of that religious tradition, which is upheld in all of Auden's works. In Auden's childhood, we find many of the beginnings of the subject that he would be drawn to in the work throughout his life. We just discussed Christianity and faith. But in addition to that, we have Norse mythology and other mythologies. The Auden family believed themselves to be of Icelandic ancestry, and so he was very drawn to Icelandic myths. As a Northern Englishman, the culture of mining and mining towns. As a child, they would frequently visit the Pennine Hills, Britain's lead mining district. And Auden was struck not only by the physical beauty of those hills, but by the plight of those who worked the mines and the political action inspired by their struggle. Psychology, especially mass psychology, the psychology of nations, of globes at any certain time. Auden's father was a professor of public health, and as a young man, Auden was fascinated by the medical textbooks and psychoanalytic texts in his father's library. He began boarding school at the age of 8, And as is often the way in British culture of that period, that meant that many of his peers throughout his education went on to be some of the most notable British authors of their time. Most importantly to Auden's life would be his friendship and on and off sexual relationship to Christopher Isherwood, who is one of the great sort of travel writers and memoirists and novelists of the 20th century. Perhaps for an American audience, the thing that might be closest to mind would be the inspiration for the musical Cabaret by Cantor and Ebb is taken from Christopher Isherwood's novel about his time in Berlin, and it's semi-autobiographical. They would continue to be lifelong friends, advisors, and collaborators. Auden continued to forge his literary path through a tumultuous period of social and political upheaval in Europe. His early adulthood was marked by a journey of self-discovery and intellectual exploration, influencing both his personal life and prolific career as a poet and essayist. His poetic voice began to emerge strongly during his time at Oxford University, where he studied English literature and was mentored by J.R.R. Tolkien, who we all know from the Lord of the Rings cycle. And it was under Tolkien that he delved deeply into the rich tradition of Old English poetry. We think of things like Beowulf, and those would also later influence his own poetic style, which is characterized by its clarity, precision, and emotional depth. However, Auden's literary pursuits were intertwined with a growing engagement in leftist politics, a stance that would shape much of his early work. He became associated with a group of politically minded intellectuals known as the Oxford Group, who were critical of capitalism and increasingly alarmed by the rise of fascism in Europe during the 1930s. Auden's personal life also underwent significant changes during this period. He openly embraced his homosexuality at a time when it was both legally and socially challenging to do so in Britain. His experiences and relationships, including his lifelong friendship with Christopher Isherwood, profoundly influenced his poetry, often exploring themes of love, identity, and social norms. He was also a very generous person by reputation. For example, in 1935, he married Erika Mann, who was the daughter of the German novelist Thomas Mann, and a lesbian. He married her in order to help her escape from Nazi Germany, and he also arranged for her lover to be married to one of his friends. And although he and his wife never lived together, they remained married and close but distant friends until his wife's death in 1969. In 1939, as Europe was on the brink of World War II, Auden made a decisive move to the United States, where he would spend much of the rest of his life. This relocation was partially motivated by his disillusionment with the conservative atmosphere of England and a desire to distance himself from its political and cultural constraints. Auden's years in America marked a new chapter in his career. He continued to produce poetry that engaged with contemporary issues while also delving into broader philosophical and theological questions. His work during this period, including the notable collections The Double Man and The Age of Anxiety, reflected his evolving views on society, technology, and the human condition. And I have a small excerpt here from The Age of Anxiety, which I find to be truly timeless. Yet the noble despair of the poets is nothing of the sort. It is silly to refuse the tasks of time and, overlooking our lives, cry, miserable, wicked me, how interesting I am. We would rather be ruined than changed. We would rather die in dread than climb the cross of the moment and let our illusions die. I think that's just lovely. Living first with Isherwood and sharing an apartment with Benjamin Britten at times, the notable British composer, Auden really set up his life in New York City. And at this time, after a bit of a lapse, he returned to his Christian faith and joined the Episcopal Church. When World War II did break out, he contacted the embassy and offered to return to the UK to serve. But at that point in his early 30s, the UK said that he was too old to be a new enlistee in the army, so he remained in New York. So as he is living in this sort of, again, rarefied artistic circle in New York with composers like Benjamin Britten, novelists like Isherwood, he was surrounded by a lot of arts and delved into broader philosophical and theological questions again. And also at that time, he meets a very important person in his life and in the life of the work we are exploring, the Rake's Progress, Chester Kallman, who was another author and poet, and who assisted Auden and worked with Auden in creating the libretto of the Rake's Progress. This was a romantic relationship. Auden himself even referred to it sometimes as a marriage, but the sexual aspect of their relationship ended after a couple of years because Auden wanted to demand marital fidelity even without a marriage, and that was not going to work for Chester Kallman. However, they remained incredibly close and sort of partners for the rest of Auden's life. Also in this time, Auden was a lecturer at many universities, places like the University of Michigan, Swarthmore College, Smith College, the University of Oxford. And he began returning to Europe, especially in the summers, to Italy and Austria, where he later bought a summer home in Austria. But also at this time, he becomes a naturalized US citizen. Auden's literary output continued unabated until his death in 1973. Throughout his career, he maintained a distinctive poetic voice that combined intellectual rigor with emotional resonance, earning him a place as one of the preeminent poets of the 20th century. His influence extended beyond the literary world, shaping the cultural and political discourse of his time and leaving a lasting legacy on subsequent generations of writers and thinkers. Of course, in addition to his significant contributions to poetry and literature, he was also renowned for his collaborations with prominent musicians. We just mentioned Benjamin Britten, one of my favorite British composers ever, who he made many works with. One that might be of special interest to this audience would be the 1941 operetta Paul Bunyan, which is very funny to think of two British people creating an opera about a quintessentially American figure. But his libretto for Paul Bunyan, it really displays a versatility of incorporating American folklore and myth into a narrative that explores themes of community, industry, and the American dream. And Britten's musical score, of course, provides a vibrant and evocative backdrop for that story. I wanted to display one poem that he wrote for a piece by Benjamin Britten called The Hymn to Saint Cecilia. As many of you may know, Saint Cecilia is the patron saint of musicians, and she is a early Christian Roman martyr whose primary miracle was the creation of the first organ, the first pipe organ, which she of legend did while having already been decapitated. And here's just the first sort of verse of the hymn to Saint Cecilia. And I think you'll see in it a lot of the reasons why composers like Britten and Stravinsky appreciated Auden's work. There's a clarity and a beauty to it. There is that sort of florid aspect of the prayer book reading that we had earlier, but it also is an example of 20th century poetry that does constrain fairly easily to norms of meter and rhyme that make song especially very possible. In a garden shady, this holy lady with reverent cadence and subtle psalm, like a black swan as death came on, poured forth her song in perfect calm. And by ocean's margin, this innocent virgin constructed an organ to enlarge her prayer, and notes tremendous from her great engine thundered out on the Roman air. Blonde Aphrodite rose up excited, moved to delight by the melody. White as an orchid, she rode quite naked in an oyster shell on top of the sea. At sounds so entrancing, the angels dancing came out of their trance into time again. And around the wicked in hell's abysses, the huge flame flickered and eased their pain. Blessed Cecilia, appear in visions to all musicians, appear and inspire. Translated daughter, come down and startle composing mortals with immortal fire. You also see in there the mixture of Greco-Roman mythology with Aphrodite, with obviously what is a very Christian text. Auden's collaboration with Igor Stravinsky stands as a remarkable intersection of poetry and music. Together, they created the Rake's Progress along with Chester Coleman, an opera based on this series of paintings and etchings by William Hogarth. And I think we should move on to those paintings and etchings. The Rake's Progress was created in the year 1735 by the English artist William Hogarth. They existed in both painting and etching forms, etchings being more easy to distribute. And I just wanted to go through the story as it exists in Hogarth's version, and then as well how it happens in Stravinsky, Auden, and Coleman's version. So first here we see the heir. This is someone who has just been awarded their fortune. They have just come into their inheritance, and we see him being fitted for new finery. And we also see to the left him saying goodbye to his former lover, who he is now neglecting and moving to a life in the city. And the next we see the lever, which is a French term that is borrowed in English, and it is a sort of intimate time for the closest friends and servants of a very wealthy person to be visited by their friends. But we see he has hired a music master on the left, and that is actually supposed to represent George Friedrich Handel, who was a contemporary of Hogarth. He's got a fencing master, a quarterstaff instructor, a dancing master with a violin, a landscape gardener. So we can see that he has inherited this wealth, and he is just going buck wild with it. Like he's going for it and spending a lot of money. In the next painting, we see the orgy. So it depicts a wild party at a brothel. We see Tom here looking a little bit worse for wear. And also an interesting detail that we see on many of the women in this picture is syphilitic black marks on their skin. From there, we see Tom narrowly avoiding arrest for not being able to pay his debts. On the right side, the woman that we see rescuing him is the same woman that he scorned in the first picture. He has escaped. Next up, the marriage. So we see Tom trying here to salvage his fortune that he has lost by marrying a rich but possibly age inappropriate woman. And we see Sarah in the background. It's sort of out of focus in this picture, but Sarah is the name of the person who he scorns in the beginning, who has saved him from arrest. And now it turns out that she has borne a child of Tom that came before his inheritance came and then was squandered. From there, we see Tom in the foreground here, sort of bottom slightly to the left. You know things aren't going well because he has lost his wig, and at this period, for a gentleman, that would not be a very good thing. And he is pleading to the Almighty to help him with the gambling debts that he has accrued while in the gaming house. In the seventh and penultimate, we see he has finally been incarcerated at the Fleet Debtors Prison. He ignores the distress of both his angry new wife and the faithful Sarah, who still is there but cannot help him. Everyone is demanding money from him, and he begins to go mad. You sort of see the distress on his face. He's sitting in this chair slightly to the left again. And in the final tableau, we have the madhouse. We see here Tom in the bottom right, foregrounded, as he spends his ending days in Bedlam. Sarah is there beside him, sort of mourning the collapse of this person. And then one interesting and really grotesque detail to this painting. We see these depictions of people with mental illness all around him. But then a particularly haunting and terrible practice of this time is we see two ladies in the upper left who are very nicely dressed. And asylums like Bedlam at this time were often viewed by many people in society as sort of tourist attractions or diversions. So people of the upper classes could pay a small amount to tour and sort of witness the mental breakdown of other people. And that is, to me, one of the most heartbreaking aspects of this final tableau is those two women just sort of enjoying the scene. Here for our final slide, I found a lovely picture of Stravinsky on the left, Auden in the center, and Kalman all together at the Teatro La Fenice in Venice, working for the premiere of the Rake's Progress. There are a few changes that they made to the story of the paintings for their opera. They changed some of the names to be more allegorical. So instead of Sarah Young being the girl who is ruined by Tom Rakewell and is trying to rescue him for the rest of the paintings, they named her Anne Truelove in a very direct allegorical way. In addition, they added the character of Nick Shadow, who plays sort of a devil or demon figure who appears as human and leads Tom Rakewell down this path of ultimate destruction. Another change, Sarah Young, in what I think is a great adjustment, the Sarah Young who becomes Anne Truelove, is a much stronger figure in the opera. Throughout the series of paintings, we see her as just this sort of victim who is there and upset and crying about the things. But in the opera, that does not include the pregnancy and birth of Tom Rakewell's child. Like, that's completely eliminated. And Anne Truelove has a lot more agency and a lot more she has her own mind in a way that would not be represented by the Hogarth paintings. Also, marriage, in this case, it was to what would have been called at the time an old maid, but in a bit of a theatrical flourish, instead, the person that Tom marries in the opera is Baba, who is sort of the toast of London and a theatrical performer who is famous for being a bearded lady. And it's this is clearly an opera created by three men. However, it is, I think, a positive note that both the role of Anne Truelove is given a lot more agency in the opera than would be suggested by the paintings. And I would argue, and we can discuss when we all meet together in Brainerd soon, that Baba the Turk, as she is named, somewhat problematically, is perhaps the most self-aware and most stable character in the entire show. So that is a brief overview of the main creators of this work. I'm happy to answer.